So as was mentioned, my name is Austin Knight. I'm a UX designer at HubSpot. How many of you all, by show of hands, are familiar with HubSpot? Maybe you've heard of us before. Cool. So for anybody that's not familiar with HubSpot, we are a software as a service company based out of Boston, Massachusetts. And we produce all-in-one marketing and sales software that businesses can use to run all of their marketing and all of their sales in-house. So as a senior UX designer at HubSpot, I oversee the user experience for all of our primary web properties. So HubSpot.com, Inbound.com, the HubSpot blog. These all receive around 8 million hits per month, so they're high-impact properties. And the processes that we use in design as we're creating these and testing these are pretty intricate, and that's a lot of what I want to touch on today. So by show of hands, how many of you all identify yourselves as designers? Like that's your primary role? All right. And then show of hands again, how many of you all work with designers on a daily basis? Maybe you hire designers? Cool. So this talk is going to be perfect for either of those two groups. How many of you all, by show of hands, only came to this talk because you hate my title? Nobody? Okay, a little bit. All right, I guess I need some more clickbait in my title, trying to enrage people a little bit here. But luckily, I think that all of us are going to get along because this talk is a little bit less about the differences between design and art, and it's more about designers. It's about the values that we hold, the functions that we serve, and the responsibilities that we have to our organizations. So, depending on which of the two following groups you identify with the most, I want you to view this talk through a very specific lens. If you consider yourself to be a designer, I want you to be thinking about the values that you have as a designer and the responsibilities that you feel you have to your organization and your fellow stakeholders. If you identify as a hiring manager or somebody that works with designers on a regular basis, I want you to be thinking about the expectations that you have for the designers in your organization and the values that you want to foster as you hire these people on. So I want to start with a few perspectives that I get from each of these groups. A common sentiment that I hear from hiring managers looks something like this. They'll say, just hire a really great designer, and you're not going to have to worry about all of that other crazy expensive stuff like user testing or an Omniture implementation. If you just hire somebody that's really good and really talented, they're naturally going to create a design that works well and performs its function and performs the way that you want it to. And from designers, a common sentiment that I hear looks something like this. People in my organization don't respect design. They don't understand it. They don't respect me as a designer. I don't have a seat at the table. And when I go into design reviews, I have people that are not designers giving me feedback on designs and telling me specifically what to do with the design. How crazy is that? They're not designers. They're not qualified. I'm the designer. I'm the expert here. I'm the only person qualified to actually talk about design. These two sentiments may seem unrelated to each other, but actually they're both very closely related. And essentially what they're doing is describing this idea of the genius designer. The genius designer that doesn't have to run user tests because they already know what the users are going to do. In fact, they may consider themselves to be a user. They don't have to look at quantitative data or analytics because they know what the best design patterns are, and they know what's going to work. And they also don't have to listen to internal stakeholder feedback because nobody is qualified to talk about design except for designers. There's sort of this all-knowing type of character that can walk into a design review with no prior context or information and automatically and consistently always create a design that's going to perform well. And they are also a myth. The genius designer doesn't exist. It's a myth that has been propagated through celebrity in design, which is especially common with junior designers that don't completely understand the field of design yet. I'm sure that you can think of designers that you would consider to be celebrities. There's a lot of them. And it's also been propagated by a fundamental misunderstanding of what design actually is. So that's what I want to discuss here today. And I'm going to break this out into two sections. The first of which is the differences between design and art, where the two fundamentally diverge from each other. And the second is the inherent incompatibilities between design and ego. So we'll start with the differences between design and art. There are three core areas where design and art diverge from each other. The first of which is the purposes that design and art serve. The second is the data sources through which they are informed or inspired. And the third is the role that creativity plays in the design or art-making process. As I go through these three sections, I'm going to make some blanket statements, generalizations that may not hold true in every single scenario. There may be some outlier cases where this doesn't hold up. I want you to pay attention more to the big principles that I'm introducing than the specific outlier cases that may break these principles. If you can pay attention to the big principles, then it's all going to make sense in the end. So we'll start with the purposes that design and art serve. We can break this out by art and design. Art is about personal expression. It's about the artist putting themselves out there, their thoughts, their experiences, their perspectives. It has intrinsic and independent value. Design, by contrast, is about use. It's about aiding the user to complete a task easier than they did before. It's about serving some type of a greater purpose. As such, it has external and dependent value. Really good way to sort of put this in more tangible terms is if I have a door handle and it's attached to a door, I can use that door handle to open and close the door. However, if the door handle suddenly becomes detached from the door, I can no longer use the handle to open and close the door, and thus the design that I'm holding in my hand is rendered useless. In this way, design is contextual because it depends on its environment in order to complete its function. By contrast, if I have a piece of art hanging on a wall in its natural environment, I can appreciate it while it's on the wall. But I can also take it off of the wall, out of its context, and still appreciate the piece of art that I'm holding in my hands. And that is because it has intrinsic and independent value. Art is about provocation. It makes you think. It challenges ideas. It sparks controversy. It spurs emotions. It generates friction, for better or worse. Design is about alleviation. It makes you think less. It doesn't spark controversy in that it always completes its impartial and ambiguous function. It reduces friction, for better or worse. Art is about exploration. It leaps into the abyss, challenging norms, introducing new ideas and concepts. And it does this for the sake of doing it. It is whimsical. Design is about observation and iteration. It takes tried and true inventions that have worked in the past, observes how they have worked, and then iterates on them to make them incrementally better over time. It is calculated. Art is about appreciation. It's about the artist putting themselves out there and letting their audience appreciate their work, or them themselves appreciating their work. The best art comes from a deep understanding and reflection of its creator. Design is about function. It's about performing that external task. The best designs come from a deep reflection and understanding of their audience. So these are the core areas where the purposes of design and art diverge from each other. And we can sum this up into one core idea, which is that art is about the artist, but design is about the user. Thinking about the data sources that inform and inspire art and design, we can take a look at the artist and the designer and how their workflows differ from each other. The artist will pull information and inspiration from entirely their own experiences and thoughts. It's perfectly acceptable for everything that inspires a piece of art to come from the artist's subjective experiences, opinions, and ideas. This actually happens in design as well. Designers will introduce their own intuition, opinions, and expertise throughout the design process. But they also incorporate external sources of data, like quantitative and qualitative data. usability standards, design patterns, accessibility guidelines, internationalization guidelines, business goals that were actually handed to them, and stakeholder feedback that was given to them by other people in their organization. When we look at the weight that each of these data sources has in art or design, we will find that the critical information that plays into design comes from these external sources. In art, however, the critical information will come from the artist themselves. So, in these two practices that we would commonly refer to as both being subjective, we find that through these external data sources that are coming into design, it is becoming increasingly less subjective. And as a result, art is and always will be subjective, but design is now objective. We can objectively validate whether or not a design works. We can objectively tie a value to a design and know which design is better than its competitors. And finally, looking into the role that creativity plays in design, we see one area where they fundamentally diverge from each other. In art, it is perfectly acceptable for creativity to be involved in art simply for the sake of the art being creative. In design, creativity has to serve a little bit of a different purpose, in that it has to help the design better solve its problem or serve its function. This goes back to the intrinsic and extrinsic values that art and design respectively hold. And a different way to think of this would be that in art, creativity in and of itself can be an end result. But in design, creativity is more of a means to an end result. And the main principle behind this is that, to give you guys a little bit more of a tangible example. So if I were on the Toyota Prius team, and I were tasked with creating the next Prius, and I were thinking about, how do we introduce more creativity into this design? That's something that people like, that's valued in design. And a great way to introduce creativity is to do something unconventional. Break the common conventions that have been associated with the design. So, because I want to do something creative and unconventional, I introduced that for the next version of the Prius, we should design it with no doors. Surely, a car with no doors is unconventional. It's something that's never been done before. It's definitely creative. But is this valuable? In order for this car, which is a design, to complete its function, its operator needs to be able to access the car to drive it around. And that is how it completes its function. So yes, in this case, we did break convention and we did introduce something that's creative, but we actually rendered the design useless. And this is because it depends on its function in order to provide value. But this is something that we do in art all the time. We're constantly breaking convention for the sake of breaking convention. And we seem to value it a lot. This painting, number 6, sold for $186 million. This painting, Interchange, sold for $300 million. That's the highest grossing painting of all time. I wouldn't exactly characterize either of these paintings as being conventional. But there's a fundamental difference here. I don't have to drive one of these paintings to work. But I do have to drive a Prius to work. And as such, it needs doors so that I can access it, and it can perform its function, and I can value it at approximately $24,000. So what we find is that art expresses creativity, but design leverages creativity. Now, even with these fundamental differences that I've laid out between design and art, there will still be times where the line between design and art absolutely blurs, and it's hard to tell where they separate from each other. And you may even say to me, Austin, you would be lying if you were to tell me that art and design don't overlap and share aspects of each other at certain times, and I would agree with you. There are times where art and design overlap. And I would also say that if you were to look at this holistically, you would find that engineering plays a role in design as well. And if we were to break out what engineering and art contribute to design, we would see that engineering contributes function, while art contributes aesthetic value. If we're working in a situation where our end goal is to create a product that delights our users, and we know that that's going to lead to greater retention, higher revenue, all of these greater KPIs that we have, then we could sort of create an equation based off of these two values to my left and right that looks something like this. With function and aesthetic present in a design, we are most likely to delight our users. But there's a few things to keep in mind as we look at this equation. The first of which is that function is pretty objective. Does the design complete its function or not? Yes or no? It's also the critical element here. Without the function, the aesthetics cannot be appreciated, and they cannot serve their purpose. As such, the aesthetics should be derived from and assist in the function of the design. The form should serve the function. To break this down into some additional equations, if we were to create a product that is both functional and aesthetically pleasing, it would be the most likely to win. That has all of the elements that we would look for in a design. There are millions of examples of these. A great example is Spotify. That's a really, really good-looking product that also performs its function very well, and people love it. If we were to create a product that was functional but not aesthetically pleasing, it actually may still win. There's also a lot of examples of these out there. Reddit is a really good example. That thing is ugly. The interface has not been updated in over 10 years, and yet it's one of the most popular and widely used sites on the internet. It's because it performs its function extremely well, and that's what people are in love with. That's the value that it provides to them. By contrast, if we were to create a design that was not functional, but it was aesthetically pleasing, unfortunately, it would be the most likely to lose. There are also a lot of examples of these out there. Ello is a pretty good example, a product that was beautiful, but nobody really knew what the value proposition was. Nobody really knew what it was meant to do. Dieter Rams has a quote for this. And essentially what he's saying here is that aesthetics are extremely important. But without well-executed function, nobody will be able to appreciate the aesthetic value. Looking at the other side of this equation, we find that aesthetics are actually pretty subjective. I can give a design to a group of designers, and one designer may love it, another designer may hate it. It's much harder to validate, but there is a proper way to validate this if only we approach aesthetics with the right frame of mind. And that is that strong aesthetic design accounts for what the user perceives as beauty, not what the designer perceives as beauty. Too often as designers, we are likely to design that which we perceive as being aesthetically valuable. But when we're designing for an audience that's outside of ourselves, what we should really be thinking about is what our audience perceives as being beautiful. This is a 1962 Ferrari 250 GTO. In my humble opinion, this is the most beautiful car ever made. This is a 2015 Rolls-Royce Phantom. In my uncle's opinion, this is the most beautiful car ever made. If I were designing a car for my uncle, and I stuck to my own aesthetic values, I'd probably create a car that looks like the one over there. But what I should really be creating is a car that looks like the one right there. Understanding what your audience values in aesthetics is what will empower you to create the aesthetics that they expect and that they appreciate. Another thing to notice about these cars is that the aesthetics actually serves in the function that they serve. It aids in that function. The Ferrari is meant to go fast, and it's a beautiful looking car. The aesthetics are very nice, but those aesthetics are also aerodynamically sound to assist in that function. The Rolls-Royce is meant to be a comfortable, luxurious, dominating style of car, and the aesthetics also serve in that function. Dieter Rams has a quote for this as well, and basically what he's saying here is that you want to make sure that whenever you're thinking about the aesthetics in a design, you leave room for the user's self-expression. Every product that we buy, every design that we bring into our lives is a little bit of a statement about ourselves. And when we purchase a product, we want to understand what we're expressing about ourselves in making that purchase. And as designers, that's something that you have to take into account when you're creating aesthetics. What is the statement that my user or that my customer is wanting to make when they purchase this product, and how are the aesthetics going to aid in helping them make that statement? What we find is that both ends of this equation essentially filter down to one thing, and that's the user. The function serves the user in completing their task, and the aesthetic serves the user in making their statement and having something that is aesthetically valuable to them. Now, even with this, you may still say, my art degree completely disagrees with you. Or my experience at this startup 10 years ago completely disagrees with everything that you've introduced here. But I would encourage you to not focus on those small disagreements, because you may run the risk of completely missing the point of this talk, which is not as much that design is not art, but rather that design is not about the designer. As we think of design as being art, we're more likely to think that the genius comes from ourselves, the designers. However, when we notice where they diverge and how design actually places all of the focus on the user, we see that the genius isn't necessarily coming from the designer. We can notice this pattern in all three areas where the two diverge. And we can actually pull some key takeaways from each of these. Designers create products that are intended to serve purposes that exist outside of themselves. The design is about the user, not about the designer. In order to create a product that properly serves its purpose, the design must be adequately informed by outside data. Designers don't magically create masterpieces. They collect and interpret information that empowers them to create masterpieces. Design is not a talent, it's a skill. Designers must leverage creativity in a thoughtful way so that the design can better serve its purpose. The design should be built with intent. There should be reason and justification behind every decision made within a design. We can kind of turn this into a litmus test for the values that we hold as designers and for the values that we expect out of designers as we work with them and when we hire them. If a designer seems to be making design decisions based solely on opinion or intuition, they aren't practicing design. They're practicing art. And the key word here is solely, because there are going to be times where decisions have to be made based on opinion or intuition. You can never have a perfect design scenario where every single time you're going to have an objective justification for your design. But if a designer is always and consistently basing their decisions on their opinion or intuition, then they're not practicing design. Focus on designers that can regularly support their design decisions with reliable data, research, or reason. And there's two key words here. The first of which is regularly. Again, they're not going to be able to do this every single time, but most of the time they should be able to justify their decisions. And the second word that's important is reason. Sometimes you're not going to have quantitative or qualitative data that you can reasonably collect to make a design decision. But there should still be reasoning that can appeal to common sense, to the business goals that you have in your larger organization, that can support the design decision that was made. This is not to say that design and art are both have different levels of importance in society. In fact, design and art are both equally important to society. However, if you hire somebody as a designer, they should be practicing design. This kind of lends itself to this idea that perhaps design and ego may not be very compatible with each other, which is counterintuitive because classically, designers have always been associated with big egos, something we've kind of been known for, unfortunately. But as we deconstruct the design process, we find that they're actually in complete disagreement with each other. But this stuff is really common, unfortunately. These two screenshots are from a creative director's portfolio website. This is real. I'm going to read this off to you guys because I love it. Alexander is among the world's leading designers. Achieving this prestige takes talent others can only dream of. Combined with bona fide commitment, Alexander's designs win award after award. His talent is rare. And then if you want to follow him on social media, it says, follow Alexander and be near brilliance. This is serious. This is not a parody, and this is one site out of hundreds that I've found where the person that's creating the site and representing themselves will not only speak about themselves in the third person, which is ridiculous, but will also demonstrate their ego throughout the entire design. But what does this do to a team when you have to work with somebody like this? I've noticed a few really important effects. The first of which is that it completely kills feedback and it draws emotional attachment to designs. If I'm designing from a point of ego, then the design is kind of a part of me. It's coming from me. And when you criticize my design, I'm going to get upset, because in a way, you're criticizing me. So when you notice a designer seems to be constantly getting upset whenever you offer feedback or criticism about their design, it's probably because in some capacity, they were designing from a standpoint of ego. However, if I design with a team that I'm collaborating with, and I'm pulling data quantitatively and qualitatively, and I'm using different information to drive the design that I'm creating, this is no longer a creation that came exclusively from me. It's something that came from a combined source of information. And when you criticize that design, it isn't an indictment of the designer themselves, but rather it's an opportunity to improve the design. They have issues with attribution of success and failure. If a design does well, it's because I'm awesome. But if it doesn't do well, it's because somebody else didn't do their job, somebody else sucks, somebody else doesn't know what they're doing. And they never really know why a design failed or succeeded. Because if the design came from you and your own genius, then why would you ever look at the data? Why would you ever validate whether or not a design was effective? So we're less likely to look at the quantitative and qualitative results that come from the designs that we create. It also kills open-mindedness. If I'm a senior designer on a team, and I introduce an idea, and then I have a junior designer come on board and introduce an idea, because my ego says that I have more experience and I'm higher ranking, I'm going to be less open-minded to their idea. But I can tell you from personal experience that on a regular basis, my junior designers will introduce solutions and ideas that are better than my own. So we're less likely to be open-minded to each other if we think that we're the best and that we're the most qualified to do what we do. And it also kills collaboration and teamwork. Nobody wants to work with a big ego. And big egos also don't like to work with other people. But we conclusively know that the best and most effective designs result from close, collaborating, multidisciplinary teams. So when we put all of this together, we kind of kill the results that we get out of design and the entire purpose for design in the first place. Why are we even doing this? And what we find is that at the end of all of this, humility is the most important quality that a designer can possess. It is the most important quality that you should be hiring for and fostering within your organization, and it is the most important quality that designers should hold and practice within themselves. On the left is HubSpot's information. On the right is my information. If you go to the short link at the bottom of the screen that popped up multiple times throughout the talk, you'll find the slides for this talk, some sources. Eventually, there's going to be a video of this talk on there. I'm happy to take any questions or debate with you guys toward the back of the room if you insist. Thank you.